I've always loved hiking. For me, there's nothing quite like the solitude of the wilderness. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the clean smell of pine, and the feeling of freedom that comes from being miles away from civilization. It's my way of clearing my head when life feels too noisy. But sometimes, solitude isn't comforting. Sometimes, it's unsettling. This story happened a few years ago in late October. I had just turned 34 and decided to treat myself to a solo weekend hike in a remote part of Colorado. The trail I chose was one I hadn't explored before, but it had been recommended in a few online forums for experienced hikers. It was supposed to be lightly trafficked, challenging, and beautiful, perfect for someone like me looking to escape for a couple of days. The drive to the trailhead took longer than I expected. The road was rough, winding through dense forest and climbing steadily into the mountains. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low in the sky. There was no one else there, not another car in sight. That suited me fine. I parked, loaded up my pack, and set off, eager to cover a few miles before dark. The trail started out well enough, cutting through a thick stand of evergreens before opening up to a breathtaking view of the valley below. The air was cool and crisp, and the light had that golden, late afternoon quality that made everything feel peaceful. I felt good, energized. About an hour in, the trail began to climb steeply, switchbacking up the side of a rocky ridge. The trees thinned out here, replaced by scraggly bushes and jagged boulders. As I climbed, I noticed the wind picking up, whistling through the gaps in the rocks. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the wind had grown stronger. I decided to set up camp for the night. There wasn't much level ground, but I managed to find a small flat spot sheltered by a cluster of rocks. As I pitched my tent, the wind howled around me, tugging at the fabric and making it a challenge to get everything staked down. Once the tent was secure, I crawled inside, grateful for the barrier against the cold. That night, I barely slept. The wind was relentless, rattling the tent and making eerie, high-pitched noises as it squeezed through the cracks in the rocks. Every so often, I thought I heard other sounds. A faint scraping, like something dragging across the ground, or a muffled thud. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, I was eager to move on. I packed up quickly and set off, determined to put some distance between myself and that ridge. The trail continued uphill, winding through a rocky landscape dotted with sparse trees. About 2 hours in, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a single hiking boot, lying in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash someone had dropped, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't old or weathered. It looked relatively new, like it had been left there recently. There was no sign of its owner, no pack, no second boot, no footprints leading away from it. Just the lone boot, sitting there as if someone had placed it deliberately. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Eventually, I decided to keep moving. Maybe someone had lost it while struggling with their gear, or maybe it had been carried there by an animal. I didn't want to overthink it. The trail grew rougher as the day went on, narrowing in places and disappearing altogether in others. I had to rely on my GPS and map more than once to make sure I was still on the right path. The landscape felt more remote with every step, and the trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Around midday, I reached a clearing with a small stream running through it. I stopped to refill my water bottles and have a quick snack. The air was still now, and the silence felt heavy. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement, but I didn't see anything. The feeling stayed with me as I continued on, the trees closing in around me like walls. The trail began to descend, winding through a narrow ravine. The light grew dimmer, the air colder. I noticed the first traces of snow on the ground, small patches tucked into the shadows where the sun couldn't reach. That's when I found the second boot. It was lying off to the side of the trail, partially hidden by a bush. Like the first, it looked new, and it didn't make sense for it to be there. This time, though, I noticed something else. A faint scuff mark on the ground nearby, like someone had slipped or fallen. I felt a chill run down my spine. The thought crossed my mind that someone might be in trouble, injured and unable to continue. But if that were the case, why hadn't I seen any other signs? No footprints, no gear, nothing? I stood there for a long moment, debating whether to keep going or turn back. In the end, I decided to press on. The trail was supposed to loop back to the trailhead eventually, and I figured I'd report what I'd seen when I got there. The further I went, the more the trail seemed to change. It grew narrower, more overgrown, until it hardly resembled a trail at all. I kept checking my GPS, but the signal was weak, and the terrain didn't match what was on the map. By late afternoon, I realized I was lost. I tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, and the light was fading fast. My heart raced as I fought the rising panic, forcing myself to focus. I needed to find a spot to camp before it got dark. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It wasn't ideal, uneven ground surrounded by thick undergrowth, but it would have to do. I set up my tent as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. That night was the longest of my life. The forest came alive with sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, something heavy moving through the undergrowth. I lay in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a new sound, a low, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps. They were distant at first, but they grew louder, closer. I froze, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. When dawn finally came, I packed up and left without eating or drinking. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. I used my compass to head west, hoping it would eventually lead me back to the trailhead. Hours later, I stumbled onto a dirt road. My relief was short-lived when I saw the boot prints, 2 sets side by side, heading in the same direction I had come from. I flagged down the first car I saw, a park ranger, and told him everything. He nodded grimly and said they'd investigate, but I never heard anything more. Even now, I don't know what I encountered out there. Maybe it was just an unlucky coincidence, or maybe someone or something was following me. All I know is that I haven't gone hiking alone since. Hiking had always been my way of decompressing. Growing up in Vermont, I developed a love for wandering through forests, climbing hills, and spending hours surrounded by nothing but trees and birdsong. Moving to the Pacific Northwest in my early 30s only deepened that passion, with endless trails to explore and mountains that begged to be climbed. In the summer of 2016, I decided to tackle a trail that had been on my radar for years, Ridgeback Summit. It wasn't a well-trodden path, which made it appealing. According to a few online forums, it was remote, challenging, and offered some of the most breathtaking views in the region. I had a long weekend free, so I packed my gear, stocked up on food and water, and drove to the trailhead. It was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and by the time I got there, the parking lot was empty. That didn't bother me. In fact, I relished the solitude. The hike started off smoothly. The trail wound through dense forest, the air cool and fresh despite the summer heat. The first few miles were uneventful, just the steady crunch of my boots on dirt and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. Around midday, I reached a clearing that offered a glimpse of the ridge ahead. It was steep, jagged, and intimidating, but the sight of it filled me with excitement. I stopped for a quick lunch, enjoying the silence as I sat on a fallen log. The forest felt alive, but not in an overwhelming way, just the steady hum of nature doing its thing. I continued my ascent, the trail growing narrower and more rugged as it climbed. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocky outcroppings and scrubby bushes. The sun was high in the sky now, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I paused occasionally to sip water and catch my breath, marveling at the views that grew more stunning with each step. By late afternoon, I reached a plateau just below the summit. The air was thinner here, cooler, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and earth. I decided to set up camp for the night. The summit could wait until morning, when I'd be fresh and rested. I found a flat spot near a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter from the wind. After pitching my tent, I boiled water for a simple meal and sat on a boulder, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the wind whip around the tent. It wasn't long before I drifted off, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the breeze. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. The wind had died down, leaving the world eerily quiet. I lay still, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. Then, I noticed it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. My first thought was that it was an animal. Deer were common in these parts, and I'd seen plenty of tracks earlier on the trail. But the steps didn't sound like a four-legged creature. They were slow, deliberate, with pauses in between, as if someone or something was carefully picking their way across the plateau. I sat up, my breath shallow. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rocks and sparse vegetation. The sound had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind maybe, or my mind playing games. But I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, my heart still racing. Sleep didn't come easily after that. When dawn finally broke, I felt a sense of relief. The world outside looked ordinary, bathed in soft morning light. I packed up quickly, eager to reach the summit and start my descent. The final stretch of the trail was steep and challenging, but the views were worth it. From the top, I could see for miles. Rolling hills, dense forests, and distant mountains shrouded in mist. It was breathtaking, and for a moment, all my worries from the night before faded away. But the descent proved more difficult than I anticipated. The trail was poorly marked in places, and several times I found myself second-guessing my route. Around midday, I realized I'd lost the main path. Instead of backtracking, I decided to forge ahead, thinking I'd eventually reconnect with the trail. The terrain grew rougher, the ground uneven and covered in loose rocks. I slipped more than once, scraping my palms as I tried to steady myself. My water supply was dwindling, and the sun was beating down mercilessly. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and disoriented. I hadn't seen a single trail marker or sign of other hikers in hours. The forest around me felt dense and oppressive, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. I decided to stop and assess my situation. My map and compass were of little use, as I couldn't pinpoint my exact location. My phone had no signal, which wasn't surprising given how remote the area was. Then I noticed something unusual. A faint path veered off to the right, barely visible through the underbrush. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked like it had been used recently. Hoping it might lead me back to the main trail, I decided to follow it. The path wound through the forest, growing narrower and more overgrown with each step. Branches snagged at my clothes, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged into a small clearing. At first, I thought I'd stumbled upon an old campsite. There was a fire ring made of stones, blackened from use, and a tattered tarp hanging from a tree. But as I looked closer, unease prickled at the back of my neck. The site looked abandoned, but not for long. There were empty food wrappers scattered around, a rusted canteen lying on its side, and what appeared to be a weathered backpack leaning against a tree. What disturbed me most was the fire ring. It was cold, but the ashes looked fresh, as if someone had been there recently. I didn't linger. The clearing offered no clues about where I was or how to get back to the main trail. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I decided to keep moving. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I found myself climbing again. The path grew steeper, the ground rocky and unstable. The forest thinned out, replaced by scrubby bushes and jagged outcrops. That's when I heard it again, the crunching sound. This time it was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Turning slowly, I scanned the trail with my flashlight. Nothing, but the sound continued, growing closer. I didn't wait to find out what or who was making it. I started moving as quickly as I could, my legs burning with the effort. The footsteps seemed to follow, always just out of sight. Panic set in as the trail disappeared altogether, leaving me scrambling up a steep slope. By the time I reached the top, I was gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. To my relief, I spotted a dirt road cutting through the trees below. It was faint, barely more than a track, but it was a sign of civilization. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely carrying me. When I reached the road, I collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted to care about the dirt and sweat caking my skin. I never saw what or who had been following me. A logging truck eventually came by, the driver startled to see me lying there. He gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I recounted my story to the local ranger station. They listened patiently but didn't offer much in the way of answers. The area was known for its rugged terrain and occasional trespassers, they said. Maybe I'd stumbled onto private land, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But I know what I heard. Even now, years later, the sound of footsteps on gravel still haunts me. I haven't been back to Ridgeback Summit since. I've always been someone who enjoys solitude. Hiking became my favorite escape when life started piling on the stresses. Work deadlines, personal obligations, the noise of the world. For years, I had stuck to well-marked trails and popular parks. But as my confidence grew, I found myself wanting to push boundaries, to venture into the lesser-known spots where the wilderness feels untouched and raw. That's how I ended up in the Laramie Canyon region of Wyoming in late spring 2016. It was a place I had only read about in obscure hiking forums, a network of gorges and ravines carved by centuries of running water. The area was remote, rugged, and not for the faint of heart. Exactly what I was looking for. I planned a 2-day solo trek, starting with a descent into one of the deeper gorges and working my way back out to the plateau. The weather forecast was ideal, cool, sunny, with only a slight chance of rain on the second day. I packed my essentials: a sturdy pair of boots, a loaded backpack with enough food and water for 3 days, a map, compass, and GPS device. I even carried a small emergency beacon just in case. The first day went almost too smoothly. The trailhead was deserted when I arrived, and the air was crisp and still. I followed a narrow, winding path that hugged the edge of the canyon before dropping steeply into the gorge. The descent was exhilarating, the rocky walls towering above me as the sunlight filtered through in golden streaks. At the bottom, I found a small creek snaking its way through the canyon floor, flanked by clusters of wildflowers and patches of moss. By mid-afternoon, I had covered a good distance and found a flat, sheltered spot to set up camp for the night. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional chirp of birds or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the sun dipped below the canyon rim, I cooked a simple meal and sat watching the shadows lengthen. That night, the isolation felt almost meditative. I lay in my tent, listening to the faint trickle of the creek and the distant call of an owl. Sleep came easily. The next morning, I woke early, eager to continue exploring. The map showed a secondary trail that looped through a narrower section of the gorge before climbing back up to the plateau. It wasn't marked on my GPS, but the map's hand-drawn lines suggested it would be a challenge worth tackling. As I packed up, I noticed the sky was a little grayer than the day before. The air had a damp, earthy smell, and a faint breeze stirred the canyon floor. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. The weather forecast had only mentioned a slight chance of rain, after all. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The secondary trail was rough and overgrown, clearly not as well traveled as the main path. In places, the ground was uneven, littered with loose rocks and patches of mud. I had to slow my pace, carefully picking my way along the route. Around midday, the gorge narrowed into a stretch known as Raven's Cut, a section I'd read about in the forums. The walls here were steep and close, the trail barely more than a footpath carved into the rock. Water from the creek pooled in sections, forcing me to step carefully to avoid slipping. That's when I noticed the first signs of trouble. The wind had picked up, funneling through the narrow passage with an eerie, hollow sound. The air felt heavier, cooler. Looking up, I saw the sky had darkened considerably, thick clouds rolling in from the west. I debated turning back but decided to press on, thinking I could reach higher ground before the rain started. I should have turned back. The storm came in fast, catching me halfway through Raven's Cut. 1 minute I was walking under a gray sky. The next, the heavens opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking me to the bone within minutes. The trail became a slick, treacherous mess, the water rising quickly in the creek beside me. I tried to push through, leaning into the rain, but the wind was fierce, whipping around the canyon walls and throwing water in every direction. Visibility was nearly zero. Each step felt like a gamble, my boots slipping on the wet rock, and then the trail disappeared. At first, I thought I had simply lost it in the chaos of the storm. I retraced my steps, scanning for the narrow path carved into the rock, but it was gone. A landslide, likely triggered by the rain, had swept it away, leaving nothing but a sheer drop into the rushing creek below. Panic set in as I realized how precarious my situation was. I was trapped in a narrow gorge with rising water, no clear trail, and no easy way out. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the roar of the creek had grown deafening. I made the decision to climb. It wasn't a choice so much as a necessity. The gorge walls were steep but not entirely vertical, with enough ledges and outcroppings to give me a fighting chance. I stuffed my gear into my backpack, strapped it tightly, and started up. The climb was brutal. The rock was wet and slippery, and the wind made every movement feel unsteady. My hands ached from gripping sharp edges, and my legs burned from the effort. More than once, I lost my footing, scraping my knees and elbows as I clung to the wall. About halfway up, I heard a low rumble, a sound that froze me in place. I looked down and saw the creek had turned into a torrent, churning with debris. The rumble grew louder, and I realized it was coming from further up the canyon. A flash flood, heart pounding, I climbed faster, adrenaline dulling the pain in my limbs. The roar of the water grew louder, and I could feel the vibrations in the rock. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a narrow ledge about 30 feet above the canyon floor. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I could do. I pressed myself against the wall, gripping an outcrop for support, and watched as the floodwaters surged through the gorge below, carrying branches, rocks, and even small trees in its wake. The storm raged on for hours. I stayed on that ledge, shivering and soaked, as the rain pelted down. The wind howled, and the canyon seemed alive with the sounds of rushing water and shifting rock. At one point, a massive boulder tumbled into the creek below, sending up a spray of water that reached me even on the ledge. Eventually, the rain began to ease, the storm moving off to the east. The floodwaters receded slowly, leaving behind a muddy, debris-strewn canyon floor. When I was confident the worst had passed, I climbed down carefully, my muscles stiff and aching. The gorge was unrecognizable, the trail completely obliterated. I relied on my map and compass to navigate, using the direction of the creek as a guide. It took me the better part of the day to find my way out. By the time I reached the plateau, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the drenched landscape. I was exhausted, filthy, and battered, but alive. When I finally reached my car at the trailhead, I collapsed into the driver's seat, overwhelmed by a mix of relief and exhaustion. I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the engine and watching the sky fade to dusk. That trip taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable and unforgiving. No amount of preparation can fully account for its power. I still hike, but I've never returned to Laramie Canyon. Once was enough. Even now, years later, I can still feel the cold rain on my skin and hear the deafening roar of the floodwaters in my dreams. It's a sound I'll never forget. I've always been drawn to the mountains. There's something about the solitude, the challenge of the climb, and the quiet that wraps around you like a heavy blanket once you're far enough from civilization. I'd spent years hiking and camping solo, so when I heard about a remote trail in northern Idaho called the Ridgeback Traverse, I knew I had to try it. The trail wasn't well known. It wasn't even officially marked on most maps. But I'd found a detailed account in a blog written by a hiker who claimed it offered some of the most spectacular views in the state. It was a multi-day hike through rugged terrain, with steep ascents and descents, and a final stretch that ran along a narrow ridge high above the valley. The blog warned it was not for the faint of heart or the ill-prepared. I planned meticulously, as I always did. I packed enough food for 3 days, a lightweight tent, a first aid kit, extra layers, and my trusty GPS. The forecast called for clear skies, so I wasn't too worried about the weather. My plan was to start at the southern trailhead, work my way up to the ridge, and camp just before the final stretch so I could cross it early on the second day. The first day went smoothly. The trail was tough, as expected, with steep climbs and loose rock, but nothing I couldn't handle. The views were incredible. Rolling hills blanketed in dense forests, with distant peaks rising like islands in a sea of green. By late afternoon, I'd made it to a small clearing with just enough space for my tent. The air was cool but not cold, and the sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. That night, as I lay in my tent, I noticed how quiet it was. I was used to the sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, maybe a distant owl, but here, there was nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind through the trees. It wasn't unsettling, exactly, but it made the space feel even more remote, more isolated. The next morning, I woke early, eager to tackle the ridge. After a quick breakfast, I packed up and started hiking. The trail grew steeper and narrower as I climbed, the trees thinning out until I was surrounded by nothing but rocks and scrub. By mid-morning, I reached the ridge. It was breathtaking. The ridge was a narrow spine of rock that stretched for about a mile, with sheer drops on either side. To my left was a valley shrouded in mist, its floor so far below that I could barely make out the trees. To my right, the land sloped down more gently, dotted with boulders and patches of grass. The trail itself was no more than a foot wide in places, with loose gravel that made every step a test of balance. I paused to take it all in, snapping a few photos before carefully stepping onto the ridge. My heart pounded, not just from the effort but from the sheer exhilaration of being there. One wrong step could send me tumbling into the abyss, but the views made it worth the risk. The first half of the ridge was uneventful. I took my time, placing each foot carefully and using my trekking poles for stability. But about halfway across, I noticed something strange. A rock cairn stood in the middle of the trail. It was small, no more than 3 or 4 stones stacked on top of each other, but it caught my attention. I hadn't seen any other hikers since starting the trail, and the ridge was so narrow that it seemed unlikely anyone would stop here long enough to build it. I thought about knocking it over. It was a safety hazard after all, but decided against it. Instead, I stepped around it and kept going. The second half of the ridge was more challenging. The trail sloped downward slightly, and the gravel was looser. At one point, my foot slipped, sending a shower of stones clattering down the slope. I froze, my heart racing, before carefully regaining my footing. When I finally reached the end of the ridge, I breathed a sigh of relief. The trail widened and sloped downward into a sheltered grove of trees. I found a flat spot to set up camp and spent the evening reflecting on the day. The ridge had been thrilling, but something about it gnawed at me. The cairn, the quiet, the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. That night, the wind picked up. It started as a soft rustling through the trees, but by midnight, it had turned into a howling gale. My tent rattled and shook, the fabric snapping loudly. I didn't sleep much, worried the stakes would pull loose and send me tumbling into the darkness. At some point, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the wind, but it grew louder. A low, rhythmic pounding, like someone striking a hollow log. It came from the direction of the ridge. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife and flashlight, though I never had to use them. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but eager to move on. I packed up quickly and started down the trail, my legs heavy and my mind racing. The trail grew steeper as I descended into the valley, the trees closing in around me. The pounding sound was gone, replaced by the familiar chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. But the unease didn't leave me. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. My GPS indicated the left path would take me back to the trailhead, while the right path wasn't marked. I hesitated, staring down the unmarked trail. Something about it felt off. The trees were denser, the shadows darker, and the air colder. I chose the left path. About an hour later, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, just a glimpse, disappearing behind a tree. My heart leapt, and I stopped, scanning the forest. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I quickened my pace, my senses on high alert. The trail grew rougher, with fallen branches and patches of mud slowing me down. Then I saw it, the cairn. It was identical to the one on the ridge, same size, same arrangement of stones. But this one was on the left side of the trail, just a few feet off the path. My stomach churned. There was no way I'd come this far only to double back. I glanced at my GPS. It said I was on track, but the sight of the cairn made me doubt everything. I pushed on, my nerves frayed, every rustle and creak of the forest making me jump. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing. The trailhead was visible in the distance, and relief washed over me. I jogged the last stretch, practically collapsing onto the gravel parking lot. My car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I drove away without looking back, my mind racing. To this day, I don't know what to make of the cairns, the pounding sound, or the figure I thought I saw. Maybe it was all in my head, a mix of exhaustion, isolation, and nerves. Or maybe there was someone or something out there watching, waiting. I haven't told anyone about what happened on the Ridgeback Traverse. I'm not sure they'd believe me if I did, but one thing is certain, I won't be going back. Hiking has always been my go-to way to clear my head. There's something about the steady rhythm of walking, the rustle of leaves, and the vastness of the wilderness that makes the chaos of everyday life seem distant. I was 27 that summer in 2017, a time in my life when things felt unsteady. Too many decisions to make, too many responsibilities piling up. I thought a solo hike on a trail I hadn't explored before might be the reset I needed. Broken Ridge Trail, tucked away in the northern Rockies, seemed perfect. It wasn't on most people's radar, just a faint path winding up through pine forests, over rocky outcrops, and into the high alpine. I'd read about it on a hiking forum where experienced hikers exchanged stories of their off-the-grid adventures. The day I arrived, the sky was overcast, and the air felt thick with the threat of rain. The trailhead was little more than a dirt clearing, with a single faded sign marking the start. There was no one else around, which suited me fine. I had packed for 2 days, intending to camp overnight near the summit and hike back down the next day. The trail started gently, weaving through stands of tall pines and crossing the occasional bubbling creek. My pack was heavy, but my spirits were high. The quiet of the forest was a welcome change from the constant noise of city life. About 3 hours in, the trail began to climb steeply. The trees thinned, replaced by scrubby bushes and jagged rocks. I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. The valley below stretched out in shades of green and gray, and in the distance, the ridge loomed, its rocky spine cutting across the sky. That's when I noticed something odd. The trail, which had been clear and well-trodden, suddenly seemed less distinct. The dirt path blended with the surrounding rocks, and I found myself scanning the ground, looking for signs of other hikers. Scuffed stones, bent grass, anything. There was nothing. I shrugged it off and pressed on, assuming the trail would become clearer further ahead. But as I climbed, the faint path seemed to vanish entirely. I checked my map and GPS, which confirmed I was roughly where I should be. Still, something felt off. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker in hours. I stood on a rocky outcrop, turning in slow circles, trying to match the terrain to my map. The landscape was a maze of ridges, gullies, and jagged peaks, all looking frustratingly similar. The wind picked up, carrying a chill that hinted at rain. I decided to find a spot to set up camp before the weather turned. I wasn't worried yet. I'd been off trail before and always managed to find my way back. I picked a flat patch of ground near a cluster of boulders that offered some protection from the wind. After pitching my tent and eating a quick dinner, I crawled into my sleeping bag, hoping to get an early start in the morning. That night, the wind howled through the rocks, a constant, mournful wail that made it hard to sleep. I dozed fitfully, waking often to the sound of shifting stones or rustling bushes. At one point, I thought I heard something heavier, like footsteps, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Morning came gray and cold. Low clouds clung to the ridge, obscuring the view. I packed up and set out, determined to find the trail. But the landscape was disorienting, every direction looking like the last. By midday, I had to admit I was lost. The anxiety that had been simmering under the surface began to bubble over. My GPS still worked, but it was of limited use in such rugged terrain. The batteries were also draining faster than expected, likely from the cold. I decided to head downhill, reasoning that I'd eventually hit a creek or river that would lead me out. The descent was slow and treacherous, the loose rocks shifting under my feet. The clouds thickened, and a light drizzle began to fall, making the rocks slick. As the hours dragged on, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew denser, their twisted roots snaking across the ground like traps waiting to catch my boots. I stumbled often, my legs growing weaker with each step. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, a break in the oppressive wall of trees. I pushed forward, desperate for a better vantage point. But as I stepped into the open, my heart sank. The clearing wasn't natural. It was the site of an old landslide, the ground littered with jagged rocks and fallen trees. In the middle of the chaos was a rusted metal frame, what looked like the remains of a tent. I approached cautiously, my stomach twisting. The tent had collapsed long ago, its fabric rotted away, leaving only the frame and a few tattered scraps. Nearby, I spotted a battered backpack, its contents spilled out and scattered by the elements. It was clear no one had been here in years. I searched the area, looking for any sign of what might have happened. There was no sign of a body, just the eerie remains of someone's failed attempt to survive. I found an old water bottle, cracked and empty, and a weathered notebook with pages too damp to read. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This person had likely been in the same situation as me, lost, alone, and desperate, and they hadn't made it out. The drizzle turned to steady rain, and the light began to fade. Couldn't stay there. The thought of spending the night in that clearing, surrounded by the ghost of someone else's failure, was unbearable. I pushed on, my exhaustion and fear fueling me. The rain soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. My thoughts spiraled. What if I didn't find my way out? What if I ended up like the person in the clearing? As darkness fell, I stumbled across a narrow animal trail. It wasn't much, but it was a path, and I clung to it like a lifeline. The trail wound downhill, crossing small streams and weaving through dense undergrowth. Hours passed. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die, but I kept moving, too afraid to stop. Finally, just as my legs felt like they'd give out, I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. I broke into a stumbling run, bursting out of the forest onto a gravel road. The light came from a ranger station a few hundred yards away. Relief washed over me as I staggered toward it, my voice hoarse as I called out. A ranger came out, his face a mix of concern and surprise as he helped me inside. Took a while to explain what had happened. The ranger told me I was lucky. The trail I'd been on wasn't maintained anymore, and the area was notorious for its tricky terrain and sudden weather changes. As I sat there, sipping hot coffee and wrapped in a blanket, the events of the past 2 days felt surreal. I couldn't stop thinking about the clearing and the ruined tent. I asked the ranger if he knew anything about it, but he shook his head. Lots of folks head out there thinking they'll be fine, he said. Not all of them come back. I left the next morning, grateful to be alive but haunted by the thought of how close I'd come to being another story left untold. I haven't been on a solo hike since. Hiking had always been my way to reset my mind. No emails, no notifications, no constant buzz of city life. Just me, the trail, and the steady rhythm of my boots on the dirt. In the summer of 2016, I decided to take on the Ridge Trail, a challenging route in Wyoming that wasn't marked on most maps but was well known among serious hikers. It was rugged, remote, and exactly what I needed. I'd read about the trail on an online forum for backcountry enthusiasts. Most described it as tough but rewarding, with breathtaking views and an isolation that made it feel like you were the only person left in the world. That last part was what sold me. I packed my gear for a 2-day hike and set out early on a Friday morning. The trailhead wasn't marked, just a dirt pull-off near a bend in the road. I parked, checked my gear, and started walking. The path was faint in places, overgrown with wild grasses and lined with jagged rocks. It was a steady climb, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. By noon, I was deep into the trail. The views were everything I'd hoped for. Rolling valleys below, jagged peaks in the distance, and not another soul in sight. I paused for lunch on a flat rock, enjoying the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. That afternoon, the trail became steeper and less defined. In some spots, I had to scramble over loose rocks or navigate around fallen trees. But I didn't mind. The harder the hike, the better it felt to conquer it. By the time the sun started to dip, I was nearing the ridge, a narrow stretch that curved along the mountain's edge. My plan was to set up camp at the base of the ridge, where a small clearing offered enough flat ground for my tent. When I reached the clearing, I noticed something odd. The area was littered with broken branches, as if a storm had blown through recently. But the trees around the clearing looked untouched. There were no signs of lightning strikes, no scorch marks, just a scattering of snapped limbs and debris. It was strange, but I didn't dwell on it. I pitched my tent, cooked a quick meal, and watched the sunset. The colors spread across the sky like fire, the peaks glowing red and orange before fading to deep blue. It was the kind of beauty that made the struggle of the hike worth it. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Sleep came easily after the long day. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling of my tent, my heart pounding for no reason I could pinpoint. Then I heard it, a crunch. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of a footstep on dry leaves. I froze, straining to hear. Another crunch, closer this time. It wasn't the quick, scuttling noise of an animal. It was deliberate, slow. My mind raced through the possibilities. Another hiker? A bear? I reached for my headlamp and flicked it on. The inside of the tent lit up, but the zipper was still closed. Whatever was outside, I couldn't see it. I debated whether to make a noise, hoping to scare it off, but fear rooted me in place. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my breath shallow. Minutes passed, and the silence returned. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal passing through. I turned off the light and tried to go back to sleep, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I found no signs of an intruder. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. I chalked it up to my imagination or an overreaction to a harmless animal and packed up my camp. The ridge was the toughest part of the hike. The trail was narrow, the drop-off steep, and the wind relentless. But the views were spectacular, with jagged peaks stretching out in every direction. By midday, I was descending into a dense forest on the other side of the ridge. The trees closed in, their thick canopy blocking most of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, damp and heavy. The trail became harder to follow, overgrown with ferns and moss. That's when I noticed the first cairn. It was small, a simple stack of rocks balanced on a boulder beside the trail. Cairns weren't unusual in the backcountry. Hikers often used them to mark difficult-to-follow paths. But something about this one felt off. The rocks were stacked in a way that seemed almost precarious, as if they should have toppled over in the wind. I kept moving, but soon I saw another cairn. Then another. They appeared every few hundred feet, each one more elaborate than the last. One was shaped like a crude arch, another like a spire. The further I went, the more elaborate they became. My unease grew with each step. These cairns weren't trail markers, they felt like something else. By late afternoon, the trail had all but disappeared. I was navigating by instinct, using my GPS to keep a general sense of direction. The cairns continued, leading me deeper into the forest. Then I came across the cabin. It was nestled in a small clearing, its weathered wooden walls blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding trees. There were no signs of recent use, no smoke from the chimney, no path leading to the door. I should have turned back then, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on the mossy ground. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was empty. Inside, the air was stale, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing a window that looked out into the forest. A pile of rocks, another cairn, was stacked neatly in one corner. The sense of unease was overwhelming now. I felt like I was being watched, though the cabin was empty. My eyes kept darting to the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, staring back at me. I didn't stay long. I backed out of the cabin and practically ran back to the trail, my heart hammering in my chest. By the time the sun began to set, I was completely disoriented. My GPS was glitching, refusing to lock onto a signal. The cairns were gone, and the forest felt darker than it should have, even for evening. That night, I didn't set up camp. I kept walking, too unsettled to stop. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, the trees looming like silent sentinels on either side. At some point, I realized I wasn't alone. I didn't hear footsteps this time, just a presence, a sense of something moving parallel to me in the trees. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow here, a flicker of motion there. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing. The fear was suffocating, but I forced myself to keep going. When dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to see the edge of the forest ahead. The trees thinned, giving way to an open meadow. I stumbled out of the woods and collapsed onto the grass, the sunlight warm on my face. Looking back, the forest seemed darker than it should have, as if the shadows were still clinging to the trees. I never figured out what happened on that trail. The cairns, the cabin, the presence in the woods. I can't explain any of it. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was too real to ignore. I haven't gone back to the ridge trail since, and I don't plan to. Whatever's out there, I want no part of it. Hiking was supposed to be my escape, no matter what life threw at me. Work stress, a messy breakup, or just the general weight of daily responsibilities. The trails were where I felt most alive. There's something about being out there, surrounded by trees, mountains, and the sound of nothing but your own footsteps, that clears your mind. It was early October, the leaves just starting to turn into their brilliant reds and oranges. I had taken a Friday off work to spend a long weekend hiking a new trail in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains. The Ridge Trail wasn't officially marked on most maps, but I had read about it on a local hiking forum. It was described as moderately challenging with stunning views at the summit. The thought of fewer crowds and a little solitude sounded perfect. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning. It was quiet, only one other car parked nearby. I figured it belonged to someone already ahead of me on the trail. With my pack secured, I set off. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that feels good once you start moving. The trail was narrow and rocky, climbing steadily through a dense forest. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird call. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached a clearing that overlooked a wide valley. The view was everything I'd hoped for. Rolling hills blanketed in autumn colors, a river snaking through the middle, and the faint outline of mountains in the distance. I took a break here, eating a protein bar and drinking water while letting the view sink in. After about 20 minutes, I packed up and continued. The trail started to climb more steeply, and the forest thinned out, replaced by scrubby bushes and jagged rocks. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I reached a ridge where the wind picked up, making me glad I'd packed a windbreaker. That's when I saw it. A small, weathered sign partially hidden by brush. It pointed to a narrow path that branched off the main trail. The faded lettering read, I hesitated. I wasn't sure this was the trail I'd read about, but it seemed to match the description. The summit was supposed to have the best views, and I had plenty of daylight left. The decision wasn't hard. I turned onto the smaller trail. Almost immediately, the atmosphere changed. The path was rougher, less maintained. Grass and weeds grew in patches, and the dirt was loose underfoot. The trees here were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The wind was stronger, howling as it funneled through the rocks, and the air had a sharper, colder edge to it. Still, I pressed on, telling myself it was just the elevation playing tricks on me. The first mile was tough. The incline was steeper than I'd expected, and the path narrowed to the point where I had to watch my footing carefully. On one side was a sheer drop, and on the other jagged rock walls. The wind whipped around me, carrying with it a strange, faint sound. It wasn't the wind itself, but something else, like distant movement. I stopped to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Pushing the thought aside, I kept going. By the time I reached what I thought was the summit, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the landscape. The view was breathtaking, but my focus was drawn to something else. A small, dilapidated structure at the edge of the clearing. It looked like an old fire watchtower, though most of it had collapsed. Only the base and a few rotted beams remained, leaning precariously. There were no signs, no indications of its purpose or history. Curious, I approached it. The ground near the structure was littered with debris, rusted metal, broken glass, and scraps of wood. Among the mess, I spotted an old, weathered backpack. It looked like it had been there for years, the fabric faded and torn. I nudged it with my boot, and a few items spilled out. A rusted canteen, a moldy journal, and what looked like part of a map. I picked up the journal, but most of the pages were illegible, ruined by water and time. One entry, however, was still readable. The handwriting was shaky, the words scrawled unevenly across the page. Trail washed out. Can't find the way back. Spent the night here. Something is watching. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion and the eerie surroundings. I put the journal back and decided it was time to head down. That's when I realized something was wrong. The wind had picked up even more, howling so loudly it was hard to think. As I looked around, trying to find the trail, I noticed how quickly the light was fading. Shadows stretched longer, and the trees seemed to close in. I retraced my steps, or at least I thought I did. But the path didn't look familiar anymore. The loose dirt and rocks seemed to shift under my boots, and every turn I took led to a dead end or a steep drop. Panic started to creep in. I checked my map, but it didn't show this part of the trail. My GPS was useless, the signal was weak, and the screen flickered before going blank. I tried to stay calm, reasoning that I could find my way back if I just kept moving. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, just beyond the edge of my headlamp's beam. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I scanned the area, but the darkness was impenetrable. The sound came again, closer this time. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a mountain goat, but the rational part of my brain was losing ground. The noise didn't match any animal I'd heard before. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't care about being quiet. I moved faster, nearly slipping on the loose rocks as I tried to find the trail. My headlamp cast jittery shadows that danced like ghosts around me. The rustling followed, always just out of sight. At some point, I stumbled into a narrow ravine. The walls were steep, and the ground was littered with fallen branches. I scrambled over them, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the noises. That's when I saw it. Ahead of me, partially hidden by a cluster of rocks, was another old sign. This one was even more weathered than the last, its paint peeling and the wood cracked. The words were barely legible, but I could make out enough. My heart sank. I realized I had wandered onto an abandoned trail, one that had likely been closed for years. That explained the lack of maintenance and the eerie isolation. I had no choice but to keep moving. The noises persisted, growing louder and more erratic. Sometimes they were behind me, sometimes to the side, and once, alarmingly, they seemed to come from above. My headlamp flickered, and for a brief moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, I saw something, a shape, low to the ground, darting behind a rock. It was too quick to make out, but it was enough to send me into a full-blown panic. I ran. My boots slipped on the loose dirt, and branches clawed at my face and arms. The sounds were all around me now, closing in. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop until I burst out onto a wider trail. I didn't recognize it, but it was well-trodden and clear of debris. I followed it downhill, not caring where it led as long as it took me away from whatever was back there. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where I could see lights in the distance, headlights, faint but unmistakable. I stumbled toward them, nearly collapsing when I reached the road. A car slowed as I waved it down, and the driver, a local farmer, looked at me with a mix of concern and confusion. I must have looked half-crazed, covered in dirt and scratches, babbling about getting lost. He gave me a ride back to the trailhead, where my car was still parked. I thanked him and sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I don't know what I heard or saw that night. Maybe it was just the wind, the shadows, and my own fear playing tricks on me. Or maybe there was something or someone out there on that abandoned trail. I haven't been back to the ridge trail since.